Welcome everybody. My name is Megan Dettenmeyer. I'm the Forestry Extension Educator at Utah State University, and I'm excited to have this webinar today. We've never done something like this, so this will be exciting. Mike Kuhns came to us today, and he's my boss. He's also a great mentor and a colleague. I consider him the go-to for all things trees, and now you all have access to him, which I do as well. He's just right down the hall from me, but this is a really unique opportunity for you all to bring your questions to Mike and have him answer them in real time. Mike has been at Utah State University since 1992. He received his PhD from Auburn University and his master's degree from the University of Missouri. Mike enjoys talking about all aspects of trees, from tree health to tree selection to tree care to tree conflicts with sidewalks and other infrastructure to tree roots. You name it, he loves to talk about it, and he knows all about these things. So he was recently in the spotlight when he spotted a giant English walnut tree here in Ogden, Utah. And this tree is over 100 years old. So I believe it's now the state champion, and I'm excited to see where this webinar goes. So let's get started. Mike's going to share his screen, and we'd like to start out with administering a poll, just to sort of get a little more information about you all. So please take a minute to answer this quick poll, and in the meantime, Mike's going to start sharing his screen. He prepared some information today, but the majority of this is an opportunity for you all to have access to Mike. So hopefully you brought your questions, and please just put them in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. Take the poll, and we will get started in just a second. So thanks a lot, Mike. And Mike's broadcasting from his home, so this is kind of fun. That's his front yard. And Mike, don't forget to unmute yourself. So, oh, looks like Mark got you. You're good to go.
And so I've launched that poll now, folks. Let's just take another 10 or 15 seconds maybe. And again, choose all that apply and then hit the submit button. And we'll just take another 10 seconds. I think we've got a good distribution, folks.
I may have missed something you said, Megan. A concrete pumping truck just drove by, but luckily it kept going.
Oh, good. That would have been bad timing.
Yeah, concrete pumping and webinars are not compatible, I think.
And Mike, can you see those results?
Yes.
Okay.
I think I'm seeing all of them. So
looks like the internet wins.
The internet wins, yes, in terms of use. So what I asked here was, as you know, was what sources you use for information about trees and urban forestry related issues. And the tops are arborist, extension service, and internet. I'm not sure what internet being read means. I guess it's the top choice.
Yeah.
Right.
And the lowest choice is your brother or your sister or your mom or dad, your family.
Unless they're related to you.
Yeah. Utility forester is also really low, but if not for a utility related question, I don't think that's really surprising. We didn't ask it in this time, but I did a survey a few years ago about asking this question, but also asking which source people trusted fully. And nurseries came up tops for use and way down for trust. And extension was kind of moderate use and high trust. And commercial sources of assistance in general were mixed use but low trust. So you can make of that what you want to. So Megan, I can start in. People can see my screen, right?
Yes. Yep. Go for it.
Yeah,
it's all you.
Trees and landscapes. So we wanted to have something to just kick things off with in case there are no questions to start up. But now the concrete pumping truck just turned the corner like he went around the block. But
We can't hear him, so go for it.
okay, yeah, he's backing out too. So, by the way, we're doing this. I'm doing it on my front porch. We had good reason to do it outdoors, and we kept losing our good reasons, but we stuck with it, and it's comfy for me. So you'll see Japanese maples from my front yard over my shoulder. And, but we thought I should have something to start off talking about in case we were slow on getting questions. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about large trees and landscapes. This is a subject that's really become important to me. I didn't get into forestry because of crabapples. I got into forestry because of bur oaks and ponderosa pines and aspens. And I suspect for a lot of people, it's the same kind of thing. Actually, I saw a little quote the other day about why people get into fixing up old cars. I've got a 64 Chevy Impala and had it at a car show last week. And part of the reason that was given by whoever this quote came from was that because nobody's going to be excited to open an old barn door 50 years from now and find a Hyundai, they're going to want the classic old cars. But for me, big trees is why I got into forestry, and I have respect for the use of small trees, but big trees are what I really like. And it turns out they're often the best tree for many reasons that we use trees for. So the tree I was leaning up against in that previous picture, I became aware of because I was in a restaurant that's from this picture would be over my shoulder and behind me to my right. And we were coming out of the restaurant, and I noticed near where we parked a large tree, and I think it was the scale of the buildings as the buildings approach it, and the size of the canopy. I realized that it had to be quite large, and you start developing an eye for large trees especially when you get into the nominating trees for the big tree program in your state or nationally. But I walked a little further, and I knew that this tree was well beyond that building, so it had to be very large. As I approached it, I started getting a little disappointed because it looked like it might be a tree of heaven, and not really wanting to diss trees of heaven, but I like them, but not as much as many other trees. And I finally got close enough and realized it's an English walnut or Persian walnut, Juglans Regia, and it was in a otherwise mostly vacant large lot, and that's a dog park on the right underneath it. But it turned out that this tree is English walnut is fairly somewhat common in Utah. They certainly have been planted since pioneer times, certainly not native. There's no Juglans native to Utah, although there's a Arizona walnut that comes close. And I just love being around big trees, and so the next time I came, a couple of weeks later, I brought the tools I needed to measure the tree, and it turns out that's a clinometer hanging from the bark there. Clinometer about 2.5 inches long, so you can see the trunk's big. And I measured it, and it was 85 feet tall, and the one way I measured it was 100 feet in crown spread, and it's I think it was 6 feet and plus in diameter of the trunk, and that's a big tree, at least for Utah. I realize many of you are from all over the country, but certainly in Utah, in our dry valley locations, which is where most people live, a 6-foot diameter tree is large. And the second time I came, when I came to measure it, I actually contacted the Ogden Standard Examiner, and they've done a couple of nice articles on the tree since. They came out that day, and then they've been investigating it a little further and found this photo of the house that used to be there, and the tree in the backyard is that walnut. So that was kind of cool. And that house was actually built, I think, in 1906 or 1904. And the tree is still there, but the houses and the streets are all gone in preparation for redevelopment. And what I found, though, and these are growth rings from the most recent years from that tree, and I've enhanced them with a pencil so you could see a little better. But for the last 6 years, it's been growing a little less than 1/8 of an inch a year, and up to 3 times that in previous years. And 6 years ago, it turns out, is when the redevelopment authority in Ogden purchased the property, trying to put together enough property to be able to develop. And this tree became an issue then when I measured it, and it turned out it's currently by far the largest that's been found in Utah. And the headline on the original article is here. So, Utah State professor hopes to save massive Ogden walnut from getting whacked. I think that's the first time that I've ever had a newspaper article written about something I was doing that used the word whacked in it. And I didn't really think about this tree as a crusade or anything. I just liked the large size, and it's in pretty good shape overall. And I've got a bunch of other graphics and slides and such with some information on why large trees are important for us and for our cities and for the countryside, and why we sometimes focus, I think, too much on small trees. But we have several questions that have been asked, and we decided that we'd go this far on these slides, and then we'll get back to the information on why big trees are so important and how to maintain big trees in the landscape. If we get time, I can always make a PowerPoint of that part of the presentation available through Megan later.
Mike, Carl asked, do you have any thoughts on the liability of large trees in urban areas and property damage?
Yeah, I know it's a worry for city attorneys. I mean, large trees, all their parts get large, including roots. So one liability concern that comes up regularly is roots heaving pavement. What you do about that. Actually, the later slides I've got talks a little bit about how to make more room for the root systems. Maybe more likely, he might be thinking about the hazards posed by above ground portions of the plant, the tree. And, you know, I think you have a lot more to worry about if you're planting cottonwoods and willows that are hanging over parks or buildings. But if you've got a strong wooded tree that's not known for breakage, then it's just one more thing in the long list of things that you can worry about. And short of having no trees, so you can think, well, maybe if we transplant or replaced all the large trees with small trees, things would be safer. But I hope that most people attending a webinar like this probably don't need to be convinced about the importance of large trees. Large trees, almost everything a tree does, it does better for us if it's large. That's whether it's intercepting rainwater to reduce urban flooding, absorbing pollutants, both the root system and the top. Much wildlife habitat value that trees have is maximized by large trees. Property values end up going up more with large trees that are well maintained than small trees. So
are you concerned about thousand cankers disease on the English walnut?
I've looked into it, and evidently, at least in Utah, it hasn't been as big a concern as it is with black walnut. And the fact is, this tree has survived the thousand cankers outbreak that we had probably 15 years ago or so, maybe even a little longer. And a lot of black walnuts were lost at the time. And a lot of big black walnuts were lost at the time, but this tree has survived it. This tree actually has been topped at least once pretty severely. It's hard to tell, but if you look close, there are some massive topped branches that need to be fixed by some additional pruning. But otherwise, yeah, I'm a little worried about it, but you know, it wouldn't cause me to not want this tree to survive.
Did you want to address any of the questions that were submitted previous, or do you want to just go on and?
Well, I think let's start with questions, and then if the questions aren't very good after a while, maybe we can move on.
Okay. So one question that just came in, recommended planting spacing for trees is generally given to allow for the maximum crown development. If I like my trees much closer, what is the minimum spacing I can get away with before competitive interactions will create significant detriment in the long run? I mean, that obviously depends on the species, but.
It depends a lot on the species, because if the species is shade tolerant, you're going to get away with more crowding. And crowding sounds bad, but I just mean tighter spacing. But you don't need to plan, if you expect a 45-foot crown spread, you don't need to have the next tree 45 feet away. And in fact, I wonder, so we didn't practice this.
Yeah, I knew you were going to do something like that.
Yeah, but I'm going to just try to
just do it.
Camera. So there's I gotta see this. There's an Austrian pine there. You're probably not seeing it, but I'll describe. I've got, I think I own like a 1/5 acre lot, and I counted yesterday, and I have 36 tree species. So I don't mean 36 trees, I mean 36 species represented. And since I have a bunch of one kind of maple, I have even way more. But what I was pointing at was an Austrian pine, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 species growing under that Austrian pine, counting the Austrian pine itself. But I've selected species that are shade tolerant, and in some cases I've let the canopy of the tree kind of crawl out from under the Austrian pine. In other cases, there's just not an opportunity for that because it's fully under the tree. But as long as you know what the trees you're planting need and how they'll react to it, you're fine. You can plant right under other trees, even.
All right. Do you want me to read the question? Do you want me to keep going through questions?
Yeah, well, the problem if I pick the questions is I'm only seeing about 3 at a time, and I haven't really scrolled through them.
Okay.
So I'm hoping
No worries.
the best.
I will. I'm interested in learning what species you recommend for drought-tolerant trees in medians in urban settings, specifically related to Denver.
So, one thing you should know about me is, I think most of the Utah people know, but I've lived in a number of places, and living in a place gives you a better feel for, to be able to answer this kind of thing. I've not lived in Denver. I have lived in southern Colorado in the San Luis Valley and in southern Wyoming on the Medicine Bow National Forest. Those are higher elevation places. Denver, I realize, is dry. It's probably not as dry as Salt Lake City. But I can imagine that a median would get pretty dry and hot. Water is the main thing. And the reason, I got to think if this is true with Denver, I think Denver, like Salt Lake City, is a city that really has very few natural trees other than trees that you would find along waterways, rivers and streams. And those would mostly be cottonwoods and willows naturally. And then there are probably some junipers as you start going up pretty quick. Of course, you get, as you go up in elevation, you get to forests, ponderosa pine and aspen and others. But a median in Denver, you're not going to plant a tree that won't need water. You will need to water. And it's just a matter of how much water you can supply and keeping the irrigation system reliably working to supply that water.
Well, Mike, doesn't it also depend on the width of the median? So, you know, you have some examples of parking strips that are really wide that, you know, well, I guess a median is different than a parking strip. So maybe I don't know.
Yeah, they're talking about the middle of the street, I assume, and the parking strips would be on the side, but it's a pretty similar situation. And what I would recommend is if you have a species that doesn't do real well in a droughty, hot situation when it's not in a median, then figure in a median it's going to do too poorly to really have. So it should be a species that even when you have plenty of open ground and reasonably good soil, if it suffers when it's hot and dry, then don't try to grow it in a median. I have a slide on this, but I can remember the gist of it, which is a few years ago, I searched around in the scientific literature on trees and urban trees in particular, found a few good authors who have measured soil available and the size of the tree that you could grow given the amount of soil available. And when you sum up their research, it's pretty consistent. And that is that you need about 60 to 120 cubic feet of soil, and that means good soil that roots can get to. So like if you have a 3 by 3 foot area around a tree and you're not allowed to count the soil 20 feet down because the roots will never get there. So, you know, count maybe the top couple of feet of soil, and that you need 60 to 120 cubic feet, and that would be well aerated soil that roots can grow in. And that's to grow a tree, that's per inch of trunk diameter. So, and that's per inch of trunk diameter for the tree that you want to grow, not the tree that you plant. So if it's a 2-inch caliber tree, 240 to, well, no, 120 to 240 cubic feet won't be enough, because presumably you want that tree to grow. So you can see that you need lots of soil volume to grow a large tree. And you can get that soil volume, say on a median, by counting some of the space that as you go up and down the median. If it's a parking strip on the side of the street, you can count on some roots going under the sidewalks and into the surrounding area, depending on the quality of the site. There are a lot of ways you can possibly get the space you're going to need, but it's mainly rooting volume that's the key, because that's what allows the tree to take up enough water to keep the tree growing in droughty times.
That leads me to another question by Daniel Allen, and it's another root question. So I don't know if you want to just answer the question or go to that spot in your talk. Mike and I had sort of gone through his talk and sort of identified some places that are some key slides that might be informative, but I'll read the question as you're opening that, Mike. Daniel asks, can you please tell us more about the predisposing factors to tree root problems? Specifically, why do tree roots surface in lawns? Also, why do they sometimes cause issues with plumbing and or foundations? Is there a reliable reference for root depth or vigor by species? And in addition, what are some best management practices to prevent these and other root issues?
Oh, that's a cinch. So there's a lot there, but when I first read that question earlier, what hit me was oxygen and water. Roots do take up minerals from the soil, but other than that, they need oxygen for the roots to survive. It's only in rare cases that the tree actually takes up oxygen and moves it elsewhere in the soil, like bald cypress can do. But to have a good tree, you need a good root system. So if you want this tree, which I found to be a really interesting tree, this is growing in Salt Lake City, and it's a sugar maple, a fastigiate form that's doing really well. But if you want nice trees like that, then you need to grow a good root system. And I don't know, we don't want to do this whole thing, but when
if you just want to push escape, and you can just zoom to the exact slide if you wanted to do that.
Yeah,
but
so
either way,
I'm not really sure there's a particular slide that really sums it up. But roots need oxygen to survive. Root systems are going to be shallow and wide. And one of the main reasons they're shallow and wide is because they can't get oxygen from deeper in the soil. So sometimes you'll hear a rule of thumb that 90% of tree roots are in the top foot of soil. Sometimes you don't hear why that might be. And one of the main reasons is because the roots can't get adequate oxygen if they're too deep. And this slide actually illustrates a little bit of what he's talking about, in particular, just how shallow roots can be and lead to successful trees, and also how wide. So this photograph is taken from a book that covers tree research or tree root research. And this particular photo is of a white spruce. So white spruce is also, there's a variety called Black Hill spruce. It's a pretty moisture-loving species, but this particular, I think you said I can roll my arrow around. So this root.
Yeah, we can see your mouse.
Okay. So what they've done here is peeled away the duff layer of this forest floor. This is a natural white spruce forest. The white spruce canopy, the edge to edge of the tree, is probably about 20 feet. They're very narrow canopied trees. And what I did then was enhanced the view, and you can see that root show up. And this, what they traced one root from one tree as far out as they could find parts of it and painted them white so they could photograph it. But they didn't dig any soil at all to expose this tree. So it wasn't in the soil. It was laying on top. But if you think about it, the mineral nutrients that this root wants to take up for the tree and the water that's mostly going to come from above ground from rainfall and snow, both of those materials are going to be maximized right at the surface of the soil, especially when you have a duff layer, the organic matter that's breaking down and releasing nutrients. And I'll show you where this tree actually is. It's this one with the white dot on it, way back in the back. And then it snakes around through, and it turned out that this one root goes more than 20 meters in one direction from that tree. Now keep in mind that there may be 5 or 6 of these large flare roots that come off of the trunk of that tree, all going different directions. And you can see that, oh, and that's just one tree. Each of these trees has multiple large roots going out. And that's the way tree root systems are, including the root systems that we, where we plant the trees in our landscapes. And that knowing that should lead to lots of thought about, okay, so that's what a tree root system wants to be. Is it worth trying to make those conditions for a tree that we plant? And also, what might we be doing to the soil that greatly affects a tree through its root system? For example, this tree was on this root was on the surface all the way from the trunk of that tree. So you can see that if you put in say an 18-inch deep irrigation trench 5 feet out from the trunk of that tree, you've cut off a huge amount of roots. And you may have cut off this root plus maybe another one. As much as possible, you should try to mimic nature in this regard. And that means allowing for as broad an area to have roots rooted in, and also acknowledging that you need to provide good conditions near the surface. And if you don't do that, you're not going to be giving the tree what it needs. Actually, there's one other slide I will try to find. I'll escape to be able to go to it. So a few years ago, for a short while, here's the slide. For a short while, there was research being done on how to get root systems contained. And actually the lower left photo here may be is of a median in a parking lot. And they've used plastic panels that you slide together. And when the tree was planted, these panels were put in with the idea that you'd keep the roots from going under those curbs and heaving the blacktop of the parking lot and so on, maybe heaving the curbs even. But it always seemed wrong-headed to me to be even bothering to do research about how to keep tree roots from being shallow when the tree does that because it's what the tree needs. And if we line the hole, for example, when we plant a tree with the plastic we're seeing here on the left, we may be able to force the root system deeper than it wants to be for a short while. The fact is, the roots, if they go under a barrier, will come up eventually. But even if we could do that for a few feet out and reduce some of the surface rooting, we're not helping the tree at all. And you can see in the lower right picture here, these roots have actually crawled over the plastic barrier and escaped. And I say more power to them. We shouldn't be trying to keep roots deeper than they want to be. We should be learning to live with it. Now, roots in a lawn are a problem that was mentioned by the question. And again, we need to explain to people who complain to us about the roots in their lawn why they are there and how to live with them, but not how to get rid of them, unless it's just an awful species choice for the site, like silver maple might often be in Utah at least. And that might be a good reason to get rid of the roots, but at the same time, you should be getting rid of the tree. So, yeah.
So when tree roots appear in the lawn, we just need to deal with it, or are there other ways that we can?
Well, mulch is the best way. If you're going to keep the tree and it's a desirable tree, then mulching instead of trying to grow turf. If the turf isn't getting enough light, which is mostly why you often with these emergent roots, you also have kind of spindly grass that isn't doing really well anyway if you're trying to grow turf. So maybe don't try to grow turf in that area. And really, surface roots aren't a problem unless you're trying to grow turf in most cases.
Tree health, Scott asked, and he echoed what you just said. Tree health is all about the root systems. He was wondering, are there good resources or collections of research to help in understanding the root structures of different tree species? And if there's none that come to mind, we can address that question and send an email out with that resource. But just thought I'd put it out there while it's on your mind right now.
A few years ago, the ISA commissioned some the development of some literature reviews on different subjects, and I'm pretty sure one of them was was root systems, tree root systems. And I don't recall how those ended up being published. I don't think they were, well, they might have been published as articles in the Arboriculture and Urban Forestry, so that'd be the place to look. It would have been, it's when I was living in Seattle for a year, so it would have been like the late 90s, or no, it was 2008,
Okay.
right around in there. So look up those review articles, and the people that were being chosen to do those were supposed to go through the scientific literature and kind of summarize what was known presently about that type of thing. There also are some interesting resources that you just have to know about. I mean, I don't think there's a compendium of all of that available, but an example is a little booklet that the Nebraska Conservation Survey Division, I think it's called, as part of the University of Nebraska. And in the Depression in the 1930s, they paid people who didn't have jobs to go out in mostly eastern Nebraska and dig up mature trees and kind of map out the root system as they did them. And there are some pretty cool diagrams from that. They have kind of a grid, an XY grid, maybe on a foot or a 2-foot scale per square, and they draw out the root system. And even though it was in Nebraska and not known for its trees, a lot of the species people could certainly relate to, like bur oak, Russian olive, cottonwoods, willows, and I'm pretty sure you could find that still available through the Conservation and Survey Division.
Mike, I just found it and it's $10. It's going to sell out.
Yeah.
I just put the link. I put the link in there so folks can grab it.
Yeah, it's the kind of information, nobody is doing that kind of research anymore. I've also got a video that is not yet available on the web, but I got it originally from the Agricultural Research Service of USDA. Has a National Soil Tillage Lab at Auburn University in Alabama, and they did some time-lapse photography of woody plant root growth many years ago, and it shows things like a white absorptive root tip growing through soil, and then they cut off the oxygen to the soil, and they put a sticker on the screen so you know the oxygen has stopped, and the root immediately stops growing. And then they start the oxygen and the root starts growing again, stops and starts. And it also shows when roots are growing through well-aerated, easy to grow through soil, and the tip gets to a hard clay layer. It shows the root kind of glancing off the clay and growing along it, trying to find places that it can go down. And that was shot on like 16 millimeter film and has been switched over to video. But as far as I know, that's not available at all to the public. But I promise after this session today, I'll contact the ARS people at Auburn and see if they ever got a good version of that available, because that's another case where nobody is doing the research and nobody probably will again. One thing I get a fair amount of questions about is people will call me up and maybe they've got a little acreage and they have something they're wondering about their trees, and they say, would you have maybe a couple of grad students would be interested in working on that? And they don't understand that research is so expensive to do nowadays, and students, of course, need to be paid so they can eat. And it's just not that easy, and certainly not common, that really involved but very applied research is being done. There's a study I would like to do, and I need to update myself on whether this is, maybe somebody recently has done it, but the application of sucrose, table sugar, on soil under trees, and their uptake of that sugar and what it does for the health of trees is something I'm interested in.
Mike, we have a question from Wayne.
So far, I haven't been able to do it. Go ahead.
Wayne asks, can you offer some guidelines on when stem girdling roots should or should not be removed relative to the severity of the problem and the size or age of the tree?
Yeah, and I'm going to go down to slide on that. If you suspect girdling roots, and there are maybe two things that tend to, well, actually, I've got a list here. So the things you should look for that might indicate that you have girdling roots that are affecting the tree enough that they need to be dealt with are unexplained gradual decline. I'm thinking of maybe the first tree that really made me aware of how big a problem this is, was a tree in my backyard. It's a large little leaf linden that you'll see a root or two on it in a moment. But actually, I went out with the city forester of Salt Lake City, Bill Rutherford, at the time, and we went up in a nice neighborhood, and there was a nice green lawn and a wide parking strip, and there was a linden that was going straight into the ground, no root flare, and this was about 20 years ago. And I said, the only thing I really noticed is that lack of a flare at the base, which later became obvious, but at the time it wasn't obvious. And but the main thing was slowing growth. So it had gone from growing a foot of growth a year on a new branch or on a established branch to down to where by the time we saw it, the leaves were even smaller than normal, and it was only growing a couple inches a year on branches that got plenty of sun. And the tree was not being overtopped and shaded by another tree. Sometimes when you see this kind of thing, there will be a sudden decrease in growth, and usually if it's a sudden decrease, I'll look for something that was done recently, like a trench or paving or something. But that wasn't the case with this tree. They ended up digging it up when they took it out because it was almost dead. And it was several girdling roots growing all the way around the trunk. I then realized that my little leaf linden was doing the same thing. And I ended up actually, this root that you're seeing now is the second time that I removed major girdling roots from that tree. And each time I had a tremendous response of the tree to me removing the roots, because in the case of the picture we're seeing here, this is a girdling root that starts on the right, grows over a very large, what would be a flare root, except it was having a hard time getting out from under that crossing root, and then it was going off the screen left. And I cut this root, and to me, that's definitely something that was big enough that it likely was affecting the health of the tree. I cut it as safely as I could on the left, trying not to injure the root underneath. I cut the rest on the right, and then I was able to pry with the tip of a spade, and I actually broke the root out. I cut some of it on the near the top of the screen, but it was really embedded in the root underneath, and I didn't want to hurt the tree much. I took that root out. It's laying there, right there, and that's where it was cut. And this is the root that was trying to emerge from under it. And I actually didn't take a picture. I should have, but this whole sunken area has responded and has grown out. I'd say these kinds of things are hard to estimate, but if you feel like you are having a great decrease in the proportion, well, say that this root maybe was decreasing the amount of vascular system that tree had by 20% or so, then it's probably enough to at least try to do something about. One problem I had with these is I didn't have an air spade, so I had to excavate by hand. This is a maple in my front yard that I excavated with a shop vac and a trowel, and it was a real pain. But this also shows it doesn't always work, and it seems somewhat species specific. I have excavated big roots on that Linden twice, and each time I bought probably another 10 years. And so now I've had the tree 20 years longer than I might have had it had I let it just decline. And it does seem that that lindens respond well, but I have 7 Norway maples. No, I didn't plant them. It wasn't my choice, but I kept them, so I guess it was my choice. And I have excavated 4 or 5 of them because of girdling roots. It's harder to figure out which roots to cut many times on these, and they don't seem to respond the way the linden does. Actually, well, this tree is like 15 feet from me right now, and it's growing a little better, but not a lot. Maybe it's just my fault for trying to grow a Norway maple. And certainly air spades are a faster way to do it, or air knives. This was at a workshop I spoke at in Minnesota at their shade tree conference, and a guy from Tennessee, Dennis something, was demonstrating use of an air spade. And when these existing old trees had been subjected to this new landscape design, part of the design involved a 6-inch or so wide steel edging strip that the crews put in, whether or not they were having to cut large trees to do it. And this tree was declining and very well might have fallen over due to this kind of treatment. But without the air spade and just walking around, you'd see that tree maybe wasn't doing well and not really know why, but it was easily uncovered when he used this tool.
Can I ask you another question about roots?
Yes.
When choosing trees in confined areas, are there any canopy size to root volume conversions that are existing that might be helpful for calculating that? Most tree fact sheets only give canopy diameters.
Well, I think in that case I would use the rule of thumb I was talking about based on trunk diameter. So 60 to 120 cubic feet of soil per inch of trunk caliper that you want to eventually have. I'm trying to think where that is. Let me go down quickly. So yeah, so this was based on some work done by Nina Bassick at Cornell, Thomas Perry, who I'm sure is not with us any longer. He was quite old when he wrote this great article in, I can't remember the journal, but it was kind of a summary of urban tree roots and how they grow, where they grow. And that's where their work, along with some other people's work, James Urban and the East Coast and some others, led me to come up with these rules of thumb. And one of them is 60 to 120 cubic feet of soil per inch of trunk diameter. But to get at the canopy area, projected canopy area, and the amount of soil and roots you might need, 1.5 to 2 cubic feet of soil per square foot of canopy area or crown area. So I think that gets at what you're talking about.
There's a couple questions about construction and tree conflicts, and just a side note, we will be discussing that on our December webinar, so stay tuned for that. But construction and tree conflicts are becoming a bigger and bigger issue in our town. Any rules of thumb on how much root volume can be cut or impacted before you should consider removing the tree? And that is a great sort of lead into Melissa's question, and I'll just read that again. Looks like you found that root volume slide, but can you give some advice on how to increase tree vitality prior to situations where excavation may be required within the critical root zone? At what distance from the trunk does it become a foregone conclusion that the tree will decline or die and/or die?
Yeah, well, a lot of this is another example of research that hasn't been done and needs to be. But here's an example of a tree. Now, you all can see this, right? They can see this, the careful excavation.
I'm looking at the Ogden, Utah State professor hopes to save. So minimize that. I think probably what.
Okay. Well, I think I can just.
There you go. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So this ain't it. This is not the answer. You can't go this close. And even though they did it very tidily and smoothly when they cut, this Linden plane fell over about 3 weeks later.
Oh.
A street tree. Not a big enough parking strip to begin with. They should have given up on either the tree or trying to have a sidewalk like that so near it, and it fell over. This is a little better, but still it's a huge tree in a small spot. They made an attempt by meandering one part of the sidewalk to give a little room. And certainly a little room is better than less room. Flexible pavement solutions may be an option, but city attorneys tend not to like to allow the city to build part of a sidewalk on private property, which is what they're doing here. In some cases, you may be able to get the property deeded to the city, so you can do that. There was a study done, and I don't remember who did this, but they actually made trenches at different distances from the root collars of trees. And so 0 was cutting right at the trunk and not allowing for flare roots. 1, let's see, that's in this lower part here. 1 is 1 times the diameter of the tree. 2 is 2 times the diameter of the tree. So if you could prune roots at 3 times the diameter of the tree or farther out, it took 7 times as much force to pull over that tree as one that was pruned right at the root collar. So I think that's a helpful research result. I'm pretty sure it was published in Arboriculture and Urban Forestry, and it would have been maybe 10 years ago. I don't remember who did the research, but this kind of research is really difficult to do and a lot of money with, but a good payoff. They found out some interesting things that we didn't know. So even cutting one root, let's see, so do not cut buttress roots at the trunk. Cutting one root reduced the pullover force needed by 12%. Cutting half of the roots right at the root collar reduced the force by 30%. So it was much easier to pull over the tree the more roots you cut. That's the story there. And these trenches were only 16 inches deep.
Going back to, go ahead, did you have anything else?
Well, no, you had asked something else.
The rest of the question, I think you covered that question. Going back to tree selection, or species selection, somebody had a comment: hackberry and elms are underused, if at all, in streetscapes. They seem like tough species, maybe lacking ornamental value other species may offer, but in terms of survival, do you think they'd be a good selection for an urban street tree? This person is asking for Denver area.
Yeah, I think hackberry is a good choice. And elms, if you can wade through the claims of Dutch elm disease resistant elms that may or may not have some American elm genetics in them, there certainly do seem to be some good elms, better elms to plant now than there were 30 years ago. But yeah, both are good choices. And on the drought hardy side, so that makes them a little better when we think about what to plant in the western U.S.
Sorry, I lost my question. Hugh had a question. Please discuss tree planting methods. ISA has a recommended detail, and arborists often have their own methods, and all of them sort of differ. We seem to use the information from the most recent Green Conference. What is the latest? Is there any latest information that you have, or do you have, I think you scrolled through some tree planting guidelines. I hope those slides are still in your slideshow. Maybe I was remembering.
I think that's almost enough for just another hour by itself, but yeah. And we're already a little past 1. But try to create good conditions for a shallow root system because it's going to be shallow whether you like it or not, most likely. It is important when you prepare soil and dig up, say, compacted soil and try to make it to where you're going to have more oxygen in the soil, that you, even though I say that roots are shallow and that we need to be ready for that when we plan for allowing for enough soil volume for trees, it also is important to go a little bit deep, because even though maybe 10% of the tree's roots are below a foot, so a foot and deeper, those deep roots, even though they're not the most common ones, are important for getting trees through really hot, dry times, because they can preferentially take water up from deeper down. but only if the roots are there. If you have super compacted soil below a foot deep, then you're not going to have roots there. So prepare your site as wide and deep as possible. Just know that most of the roots are going to be shallow.
Great. I'm going to have Mark launch our evaluation poll, folks. Mike said he can stay with us for an extra 10 minutes. So we are going to keep answering questions and hopefully get through some of them. But before you sign out today, please take the quick poll. Are trees with inadequate irrigation more susceptible to wind damage?
Yeah, I saw that question earlier and thought about it, and not that I know of, but I could think of one, I guess one way that they are. If you really get into trying to grow large trees in xeriscapes, and we all need to get the word xeriscape out of our heads. It's xeriscaping, which is landscaping with less water. If we are trying to grow trees, say in sites that are getting 15 inches or less of precip, or wherever they're getting their water from, if they're getting 15 inches or less, that's not enough to grow a tree. Therefore, if you plant a tree and you irrigate it with an irrigation system that is going to give just enough and no more, which is often what someone trying to grow a xeriscape is trying for, you could end up with such a confined root system that you wouldn't end up with enough roots to hold the tree up. On the other hand, as I think about it, if this is from the beginning of when that tree was planted, you'll never grow a tree big enough to worry about its stability if you don't give it enough water, so it just won't do well. So I suppose if you cut way back on irrigating a large tree that had been getting plenty of water and now isn't getting so much, the worst thing you could do is cut back on irrigation by decreasing the lateral spread of the irrigation application so much that, let's say it had been getting water from 30 feet all around it, and you cut the number of, say, micro sprinklers or drip emitters, or just the sprinkler coverage from your lawn to only going out 10 feet around the tree in a very dry environment, you could, over a number of years, decrease the amount of root system to where the tree might not be stable. But again, you'd have plenty of warning, because a tree that got unstable physically because it didn't have enough root system is going to be a really bad looking tree well before it becomes unstable.
Just a side note, there are some pretty specific questions in here, so I will grab them and forward them to Mike so he can answer them, individually if he has time. So this is just kind of a general question. What are some effective ways? Oops, I'm sorry. Can you talk about experiences communicating the benefits of trees to municipalities, developers, or others involved in creating policies? Have you been effective in getting these practices implemented? You've been doing this for a while, so I thought that might be a good one to end on.
It's tough. This walnut, this English walnut as an example, the first that the city redevelopment agency and the city council knew about current interest in this tree was them seeing that headline about me trying to keep from getting it whacked. And I'm sure that a person or two are pissed off. And I may not have handled that as well as I could have, except I didn't pick the word whacked. But I think you need to be polite but firm when you're dealing with people. You have to, I guess the one thing I've gotten pretty good at is I know where the people who might be against saving a tree or doing good things for trees, I know where many of them are coming from, but I haven't translated that very well, very often into meaningful action that saves trees or gets more trees planted or gets trees better taken care of. Too often, I may have made a little bit of inroad with utility foresters. I did a study of what the public thinks about utility forestry quite a few years ago. There were a couple of papers published from that. And what I found was people don't trust utility foresters. They think utility foresters don't care about trees. They also think utility foresters aren't very knowledgeable about trees. And their jobs are counter to especially the growing of large trees in many cases. But I've gotten to know some utility forestry people, and we've talked about these things, and that's probably where I've had the best effects, where I get to know people and we talk when tempers aren't so heated. But for this walnut, as an example, there's been a couple newspaper articles. It's made several TV stations, and it's actually been in newspapers around the country. And my next step needs to be to reach out to the head of the redevelopment agency, who has talked with the reporter from the original newspaper story, and offer what help I can give in either giving them advice about this particular tree and what it needs, how best to save it, give them advice on how to work it into a development plan, and then see whether there's something that they are going to be willing to do. But in this case, maybe the first thing I did that turned out to be right, even though it might have made somebody a little bit mad, was I raised awareness of this tree, of its existence and the importance of big trees. And there's a lot more people from Ogden who know about this particular tree. And hopefully some Ogdenites will step up and help save it.
Yeah, I put the link to the story in the chat window, and but I think there's a lot of great information that you provided today, and like I said before, there were some specific questions in the Q&A that I'll grab those, and I have contact information, so if Mike has time and is inclined, he can address those specific questions. I'd like to thank Mike and thank Mark for tuning in today and helping us facilitate a great webinar. And again, this was recorded, so you can check back on our website and watch it again and again. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Mike.
Bye-bye.
Bye.